Okay, so I shall now bring over to you Dr. Tom Fleming from Creative Consultancy. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Is this mic working properly? It sounds very echoey. Yeah, that's better. Yeah, I don't want to hear myself too much. It should be amplified for you rather than for my benefit, and that's the important thing. Thank you very much for coming to this session. It's a real honor to be here, and I want to thank Magic for this incredible event. I also want to thank the British Council for introducing me to Magic and giving me the opportunity to be here today. It's always a pleasure being in Malaysia, and I've been coming here now for a couple of years and working closely with partners here to explore how we can support the creative ecosystem, to support the creative industries overall to develop and to grow. My talk today is a little bit of a departure from a lot of the talks that you're having in this event, in that I'm not talking as an entrepreneur who is developing new content or new tech. I'm talking as an entrepreneur who supports policymakers and investors and partners and organizations in the creative industries to, in a sense, coordinate themselves, to get their act together so that we can support an enabling environment where creative entrepreneurs can flourish, can explore their potential and develop their talent. So in a sense, I'm talking from a perspective slightly from the margins, looking in and trying to identify how in a city or in a country you support your talent and make the most of your creative opportunities. So that's just a bit of context, really. Just about me, I run a research and consultancy company. We're based in the UK. We work all over the world in advising governments, advising cities, working with institutions like universities, cultural organizations, and also with creative businesses and tech businesses to identify how to develop and grow this thing called the creative industries, or the overall creative economy. Most of our work is in emerging economies, however that's defined. Although we're based in Europe, we work a lot in Southeast Asia, we work a lot in, this is not working, this is hissing and fuzzing and, that's it, yeah, a little bit, thanks. When we work a lot in Latin America, I just came back from Peru a couple of weeks ago, and all over the world, governments, cities are trying to explore how they nurture their creative industry sector. This is driven by a range of things. It's driven by processes of economic and industrial restructuring, where traditional industries have been disrupted by digital technology, by a very mobile set of knowledge workers, by, I guess, a sense of the opportunity to develop higher value goods, higher value services, and to nurture the talent that every country has. The creative industries are in a sense, a construct, but they're a way of reimagining what the economy might look like. If you look together, if you put together those industries which have their origin in individual creativity. If you think about the tech sector, what's the tech sector without content? What happens when you marry people who are fired by their creative imagination, who are telling stories, who are generating ideas? What happens when you connect those to the people who are working through the tech? If you look at the creative industries, sectors such as music, film, animation, performing arts, crafts, design, they're all driven by the power of the imagination. They're all mobilized by people exploring the boundaries of their creativity. They're intrinsically aspirational. And therefore, you can see why countries across the world are looking to explore what their creative potential is, how to nurture their creative economy. But the bottom line is, of course, that it's not just about creativity for the sake of it. It's creativity as a driver for economic competitiveness, directly and indirectly. So the United Nations has been talking for years around how the creative industries is a major economic force, a high-growing sector, growing faster than other parts of the economy, driving innovation and growth, enhancing competitiveness, and disproportionately high growth in developing or emergent economies. It's wherever you stand in the world, a significant employer, and a significant value adder. But in major cities, in hubs, in clusters, such as where I'm from in London, we're talking about a major driver unto itself. And there's nearly 1 million people working in the creative industries in London. It's providing more than 10% of the economy, of the economic growth. And that's before you start talking about the spillovers that it generates. So in the UK, there's been a lot of work over a long time exploring how the creative industries is a dynamo for, or a flywheel for, economic growth and competitiveness. And there's been a lot of policy development and investment programs around that. And one of the things I'm going to do today is explore with you what the kind of policy drivers might be. How can we support creative entrepreneurs to develop and to flourish in KL and across Southeast Asia? And how can we ensure that we get the narrative right, so that we position creative entrepreneurs, creative talent, at the heart of the conversation in terms of how we redefine our economy, how do we redefine our cities, and how we collectively explore new ways of working that celebrate the idea of a creative job, the idea of an artist, the idea of an animator, the idea of a filmmaker as critical to the overall innovation ecosystem, developing and generating spillovers in the economy, for place, and for innovation overall. And of course, there are key drivers here. We wouldn't be talking about the power of the creative industries in the same way if it wasn't for digital and the disruptive role that's had in everything, in the way we live, the way we work, in the business models that are there, and in the scalability opportunities that you have through supporting the creative industries. So somebody who's telling stories in a pre-digital age would only be able to reach markets this far away. Digital obviously opens up the world to them, but it also opens up opportunities for new types of collaboration, working with the tech sector to develop the business models of tomorrow. But it's really about people. It's a people-centered sector. As I mentioned, it's about the ideas, the aspirations, the imagination, the things that compel you or propel you to participate. And the challenge, I suppose, is around how you marry, on the one hand, an artistic or creative impulse with, on the other hand, an entrepreneurship impulse. How do you connect the ideas that you have as a creative with the idea of reaching out to and generating products and services to a market? So a lot of the policy work and investment work is around exploring how to support creative entrepreneurs to develop and to flourish. And that's because, of course, so much talent is wasted. So many ideas just hit the wall. And so many people aren't given the support, aren't given the pathways, they don't have the nurturing environment to explore their talent. And it's quite interesting. There's a lot of research that's explored who participates in the creative industries, and I think this is the same actually for the wider tech sector. It tends to be people from a reasonably or relatively privileged background who have access to social capital, have access to certain kinds of skill sets, access to the kit, the technology, or the space to thrive. Yet if talent is your resource, which it has to be in any knowledge-intensive sector, then if you're not utilizing your full talent base, then you're not making the most of that resource and you're not going to grow to your potential. So a lot of policy and support is around how you nurture the talent base. The talent is not wasted. And of course, this comes to looking at a whole range of interventions across an ecosystem. There's no one-size-fits-all. There's no simple tool. There's no big lever you can pull to support and develop the creative industries. We have to look at a kind of cultural and economic gardening methodology that brings together different interventions to nurture an ecosystem that enables talent from different backgrounds to flourish and talent to interconnect and to develop interdependencies so that you can have a sustainable and inclusive creative industries sector overall. Now, Malaysia, as a really dynamic and growing knowledge economy, has a superbly competitive, fiercely competitive tech sector. The creative industries can be the thing that powers the next stage of development and growth. As I mentioned earlier on, you need the content, you need the stories, you need the distinctiveness, and you need the authenticity if you're going to develop and grow your wider tech and knowledge sector. The bottom line is, the creative industries can be a provider of high-value jobs, can be a driver for innovation and competitiveness. I really want to use this machine. It's supposed to highlight things. Doesn't do it. It was doing it in the warm-up. This is supposed to be a newfangled pointer thing that... The top one. There you go. Look at that. Isn't that fun? It's about leveraging the comparative advantage that you have in this country and in this region more generally, a rich, distinctive culture, strong digital expertise. You speak several languages, but English is obviously a language that gives you currency internationally, a strong focused vision on entrepreneurship. And there's a really coordinated approach underway at the moment towards policy and partnership in the creative industries, which I'll talk about in a minute. And Malaysia, I think, is getting ahead of the game in terms of joining the dots that you need to develop if you're going to develop and grow your creative industries. But there are lots of challenges there as well. It's all about, though, the piece of the pie. As I mentioned before, the creative industries is growing globally. So there are opportunities there. There are some low-hanging fruit, in a sense, for every country. But it's about how big you want to go, whether you want to follow or whether you want to drive. And of course, at a regional level, different countries are taking the sector seriously as well, whether it's in how they're positioning their brands or whether it's actually having a structured and systemic approach to sector development. I just came back from Manila yesterday, where the Department for Trade and Industry is setting out a creative economy roadmap for the country, is trying to develop their competitive edge to get their piece of the pie, their share of the pie, bigger. Indonesia, obviously with a huge domestic market, is the kind of new kid on the block when it comes to policy and development in the creative industries. But in a sense, we need to watch this space because they have the potential to really develop and grow. And in terms of best practice, South Korea, which a generation ago was no way near the heart of the argument when it came to good practice in supporting creative talent and connecting creative and tech talent. Look at where they are now. Look at how successful they are from popular culture in K-pop right through to having incredible ecosystem for animation and gaming. That is not by chance. The talent is there, but the talent is also here and in lots of other countries. But what they did was, through a coordinated, committed, systemic approach with leadership at every level, they developed the creative industries as a national driver, right in the foreground of their national project. So Malaysia has a lot of potential, but so does any country. So how do we nurture our distinctive assets here? How do we develop and grow from the combination of elements that we have already in the ecosystem? How do we connect the talent? How do we connect the creative and the tech? How do we create pathways for development and employment? So for the last few years, I've been working with colleagues in Malaysia to try this out, to test some of the thinking here, including organizations like Think City, British Council, and MIPA, My Performing Arts Agency. We've been shaping up a creative economy blueprint for KL and the Klang Valley. And this is a first step, really, in terms of looking at what the asset base is, thinking through what the distinctive profile and dynamics of this sector is, and identifying collectively what the drivers might be for a high growth and high profile and distinctive creative economy. We've set some aspirations out, and these are still a work in progress. We're hoping that this will be launched next year by the PM. But we think that collectively, across this conurbation, across this metro area, the Klang Valley has the moving parts potentially to be a leading creative hub in the creative economy by 2027. We think that there's a lot of employment that still can be generated through the creative industries. You generate a lot of jobs in tech, but you need also to generate employment in the creative industries to take tech to the next level, but also to develop a more mixed and balanced economy. And why not? As I mentioned, you've got the talent base, you've got the tech entrepreneurs, you've got the hygiene factors. Look at Cyberjaya, but also look at some of the other elements that you have in the country, which I'll go on to in the rest of this talk. Why not explore this opportunity? And there are movements afoot towards doing that. So there is a new cultural development agency that's just been launched called Sendana, and the CEO is actually in the room, and I won't point her out, but Izan Citrana even has been driving this for a long time as a kind of passionate leader in connecting the arts and the cultural sector to the commercial creative industries, and that's a critical point to make. The arts and cultural sector historically sat over here, artists doing this for themselves, dependent on subsidy, never going to grow businesses, and creative and tech was over here. The new Sendana agencies, it will play a fulsome role in ensuring that we energize, empower, and reorganize the arts and cultural sector to develop the grassroots and the talent base that will enhance the commercialization of the creative industries. And so watch this space in terms of what Sendana is going to do. But this is part of a process of rethinking and restructuring. There isn't, as I mentioned, one tool that's going to develop and have a transformational impact in the creative economy of Malaysia or anywhere else. We need to rethink our approach from the bottom to the top. And we need to ensure that we do this in a distinctive way. As I mentioned, Lots of countries are already trying to explore their creative potential. And if you go around the world, you'll see lots of cities are also trying to join up their creative assets in a more strategic way. Some, though, are doing it more seriously and in a more embedded way than others. Some places just prefix their place name with the word creative and think that's job done. That's not what we're going to be doing in Malaysia. We need to explore this in a root and branch way, in an evidence and partnership-based way. And the UN talks emphatically about the need to explore local development pathways in the creative economy. And that's also a critical point if we're going to be inclusive, nurturing communities to self-activate, providing and developing and shaping communities of practice where people can develop new ideas, new business models in the creative industries. And it kind of links to these big fundamental questions like this. What kind of economy do we want to have? What kind of city do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a place that's hard-edged, that's homogeneous, that's anywhere world? Or do you want to live in somewhere that has that distinctive personality, where the cultural identity is to the fore, which is always changing, always looking for the new, developing new stories, new narratives, mobilized by new content, and supported by creative talent? And I think that's an interesting dilemma for Malaysia, and it's here we are in Cyberjaya, which is an interesting model in terms of a kind of concentration, coordination, the campus model for tech, which obviously is emerged in Silicon Valley and in a few other places. But to what extent, though, can that be a distinctive proposition in a global marketplace? And how does it sit within the wider Klang Valley area, where you have the opportunity to develop something that is more distinctive, which you could only get here, which in turn is important, I would suggest, for competitiveness, and also important in terms of attracting inward investment, retaining talent, and attracting talent. So to what extent does Cyberjaya sit alongside other parts of Klang Valley to contribute to this distinctive creative city, this metro Kuala Lumpur? And what does that do in the context of the wider Malaysian creative economy? And to what extent do people from different backgrounds, from different sectors connect, interconnect, co-create to generate new types of value? So when we have the tech sector, does it connect with the cultural sector? Does the higher education sector work with the non-formal learning sector? Do people in different art forms bump into each other? Are there commissioning opportunities to join together different parts of that creative ecosystem? Where do the creative interactions take place? Not just where you're meeting people who are like you, where you're meeting people who have something else to offer, who can disrupt you just as you can disrupt them. And of course, the bigger picture here is this is not just about generating jobs through that codified creative industry sector. It's about what might happen when you bring together those different activities, when you connect people from different backgrounds, different walks of life. And that's where you get this sort of opportunity of indeterminacy, this sense of we don't know where this is going, but we know that if we keep nurturing it, building those connections, it might bring us something that we didn't expect, but is going to be transformational in terms of our economy, or transformational in terms of our identity. Because we don't know where the next disruptive entrepreneurial model is going to come from. We don't know where the next big disruptive business model is going to come from. So in all of that, there's a big, heavy policy and investment challenge. Where do we sit in Malaysia in a global context? What are the assets that we can develop and nurture? What are the tools at our disposal? What is the role of government in that mix? How does government work with the private sector? How do the big organizations in the private sector work with and nurture the smaller organizations? What's the role of the third sector? What's the role of the school sector? A whole range of things there. And how quickly can success be developed? Now in the UK, which is for different reasons positioned itself as a kind of global creative hub, this has been a long journey. There's been a long journey and from a policy perspective over a generation. When it was in the late 90s where the government said, okay, we've got these things that collectively are a massive driver for the economy, these things called the creative industries. There's a lot of research done, baseline mapping, industry partnership, creative industries task force, higher education partnerships, all sorts of applied research, all sorts of pilot activities to explore what is possible. And it's only really in the last couple of years when we've started to see this really, really joined together. And it's only in the last couple of weeks where the government has had the confidence to give the private sector a role in independently reviewing the creative industries, the strengths that we have, the opportunities that we have going forward. And it's only now in the last couple of weeks that the government said to the private sector, what is it that we can do with you? Not what is it that you can do for us, what is it that we can do with you? And this independent review of the creative industries sets out some key priorities as part of the new industrial strategy for the UK. And one of the key recommendations is to develop a whole range of new creative cluster programs across the country, investing in place-based creative activities. With some big aspirations. As I mentioned, the creative industries in the UK is also already quite a large sector, but it's not, from the private sector perspective, large enough. So there's an aspiration to create another 1 million jobs over the next few years. I just want to, before I go into some questions around where we go in a Malaysian environment, to just caveat all of this. Because it's very easy, I think, for partners across the public and the private sector to be quite evangelical about the role that the creative industries has, the role of creativity in society. Every politician likes to stand up and talk about how creative their country is, how creative their people are, which is lovely. It's great that they all come out and say that. But it's a good news narrative. It's hard to say, well, that's a bad thing, being creative. What are you saying that for? We've got other things to focus on. But there's a difference between the rhetoric of being about being creative and supporting and genuinely investing in creative talent on the one hand, and on the other hand, doing something about it. Because there are no quick fixes, as I mentioned. There's also a danger of a set of more challenging or negative externalities when it comes to this creative agenda. And I think it leaks across into the tech agenda as well. So we were all very celebratory about the importance of entrepreneurs, and why wouldn't we be? We all talk up the role that the knowledge-intensive sectors have in our economy. We all want to support creative talent in different ways, but who benefits, or in other words, who doesn't benefit? So some of these narratives almost appropriate creativity, the creative class, the hipster entrepreneur, the urbanpreneur. But to what extent are they commodifications of an aspiration linked to creativity as opposed to something which has some real meat that is generating employment beyond the fragility, the extreme fragility of the gig economy, the freelancer, celebrated on the one hand, and yet they have no kind of rights in the workplace. They struggle for work across a portfolio existence. It's not all a garden of roses. There are lots of strategic challenges to ensure that we don't just celebrate, we also support. And also, there are some challenges in terms of the urban system. This is in Shoreditch in London, the white-collar factory. This is where global capital collides with creative capital. It's a major development right in the heart of the district of Shoreditch, right next to the City of London, but an area that was, over many years, becoming more creative in that artists moved in. It was a low-cost area in the 80s and 90s, became increasingly a place where creatives co-located, became an area which also grew a nighttime economy. You get the sense of what I'm talking about, this kind of creative district. But when capital moves in, it raises questions around whether some of those things that made it attractive and dynamic and distinctive can afford to continue to be there. And to what extent is this a place which is actually appropriating that creative narrative for the benefit of other sectors which have global money behind them, as opposed to being inclusive for creative talent to participate and continue to develop and grow? So what creativity can there be when only money can buy your next opportunity? Many creative businesses, particularly the micro businesses, and the creative industries, by the way, is disproportionately made up of micro businesses. They can't afford to be in those places and spaces which are celebrating and supporting, notionally supporting, the creative industries. And there are also some other challenges afoot. So digitalisation is obviously a key driver for creative competitiveness and for scaling up creative businesses. But to what extent are digital skills available? Not just across the workforce, but also in schools, in the college system. To what extent is there a digital divide in your talent pool? And if there is, then there's going to be a divide in your workplace. Now, I just want to go through a few things that I think are important in terms of nurturing and joining the dots, looking at an integrated, systemic approach to supporting creative businesses, creative talent across the economy. There are 7 key things that I think are vital. 7 Ps, I should say. Or it should be 6 Ps and 1 R in a Malaysian context for the ringgit at number 6. And I'm just going to run through these and with you perhaps reflect on where we are in Malaysia and what we might do tomorrow to support and develop and grow our creative economy. And just as a way of giving a bit of context for the rationale behind the next 7 things, I think borrowing from a colleague of mine, Charlie Ledbetter, there are 2 ways of understanding what we need to do to nurture creative talent in our economy. These are issues of clocks and clouds. So clocks, that's the structural stuff. That's the harder infrastructure. That's the buildings we're in. That's the pipes, the technology, the connectivity. That's the infrastructural conditions. Whereas the cloud stuff, equally important, that's the networks. That's the culture. That's the social spaces. That's the spaces where the interactions take place. And that is, if not more important than the harder infrastructure. And often places get carried away with the hard stuff, the clocks, and not the clouds. So first of all, goes without saying, creative talent. Do we in Malaysia support our creative talent to its full potential? How might we do that? How might we ensure that there's a strong talent pipeline, a diverse talent pipeline across the creative economy? So we need to go back to the beginning here. If you think back to your time in school, to what extent did you have an arts education? To what extent were you encouraged to use both sides of your brain, to collaborate, to take risks, to work in teams, to try stuff out? To what extent did you feel that you were valued and that you were not just given an education focusing on what we call STEM, the science, the technology, the engineering and the maths, but also STEAM, the A in the STEM, the things that power your imagination, allow you to dream? Did you have support for creative literacy? And this is important. It's not just about nourishing rounded individuals. It's not just about those sets of competencies. It's also about building in the adaptiveness, the agility for your workforce to cope in a very indetermined, unknown future economy. The top 10 jobs in 2010 did not exist in 2004. So notionally, if you've got creative skills, if you're able to explore, then you're going to have the ability to cope with that hugely indeterminate future. What are the coping mechanisms and literacies that enable you to flourish in that economy? So we would argue that creative education is central to that. So what are the mechanisms for that? In the UK, there's been a reasonably joined-up approach there. There are creative and cultural skills councils that work with the further education sector to develop an array of accredited technical skills programs linked to the skills development needs of the creative industries and the tech sector, but also a set of wider competencies linked to creative entrepreneurship. There has been, as well, a lot of movement towards restructuring the notion of creativity or a creative job in the workplace. So thinking back again to your education, when you went to a careers guidance officer or someone came into school to talk about what job you might get, or when your teacher talked to you about where your future might lie, was even the idea of a creative job something that was given as a proposition, as an opportunity? Or was the idea of a creative job something that was seen as for people who didn't succeed in their exams, who struggled academically? Yeah, you don't want to be an artist or a musician or a designer. They're not real jobs. Come on. So this is a cultural issue, and obviously we need to work with the generations, with the parents in that context. But the schools can provide an enabling environment in validating the importance of a creative job and the importance of creativity more generally. And then we get into the further education sector and the higher education sector. To what extent, allied to the core competencies that you might have in a technical skills development area, to what extent are you also getting a more holistic supporting environment that focuses on creative entrepreneurship, twisting your technical skills into exploring what business models that might generate, in thinking imaginatively about how you can apply your creative skills to develop content, develop narratives that could have an application with let's say, a tech business that in turn could generate a new business model. And to what extent are you given the equipment, the accounting skills, the management skills, the collaboration skills to flourish in an increasingly portfolio-driven employment landscape, where you don't have one job for very long, you have multiple jobs, all at the same time, juggling a portfolio existence. Just a little plug here. In this building with Magic and the British Council, the National Endowment for Science, Technology and the Arts, Nesta, from the UK, is going to be in town in a couple of weeks' time to deliver a creative enterprise program exploring how you do support and nurture creative entrepreneurship. And I think it will be, you know, if you are running a creative or a tech business, or you're starting out, it'd be a really good thing to go to explore your creative ideas and think about their commercial application, and also to think about those wider competencies that are so important if you are going to flourish in a creative workplace. So I'd argue we need a holistic approach to creative education, from the schools to the university sector. We need to champion creative entrepreneurship from an early age, and we need to ensure that there are coordinated links between industry and business, so that industry is informing the education rather than education coming from the Ministry of Education or from the schools themselves. So how do we build those pathways for creative talent to flourish? We can only do that through partnership that connects industry needs as they change with education needs. I don't know, when you went to university, the extent to which your education was departmentalized. Did you, within your department, connect with people from other departments, from other faculties? To what extent did you have any kind of creative entrepreneurship guidance within your core discipline? To what extent did you have exposure to industry when you were at university? Were there internship opportunities? Did industry come in to the university to work with you? And when and if you were in an incubator model, spinning out of the university, to what extent was that connected with the wider ecosystem out there? Or were you kind of hermetically sealed within the institutional landscape? Universities are critical in this landscape. One example I really like is in the city of Etienne in France, La Cité du Design. So this is where the university has played a transformational role in economic diversification, focusing on design across the board. They placed themselves as drivers of economic change, of industrial change, and also played a civic role in repositioning that city through its creative competencies in design. So rather than this being a university that just spins out graduates somehow to sink or to swim in the workplace, they've worked as almost in a way a cultural organization might work. They've worked as cultural or creative producers. They've been key partners driving the International Design Biennale. They've driven this program called Design in the City, a whole commissioning program around urban space, around innovation in the urban landscape. And they've been a funder, an investor, 286 R&D programs, lots and lots of businesses inside and outside the academy supported. They've mobilized creative startups, but they've also looked at the civic value here. They were key partners to St. Etienne being nominated as a UNESCO City of Design, a place that is seen as, on a global level, as having as a center of excellence in embedding design thinking, design practice across the urban and civic landscape. So the university really opening up, playing a much more proactive leadership role in the creative economy. So to what extent does that happen in Malaysia? And to what extent do our key support agencies, such as MDEC, and its human capital development programs, to what extent does that join the dots? Does it play an advocacy role into the school sector? Does it join together universities? Does it open up the university sector? How does it connect different parts of the industry landscape, not just the big businesses, but also the small businesses? How does it work with the arts and cultural sector so that you get that feed-in of creative ideas and creative talent? So in terms of people, how do we nurture the ecosystem? How do we collectively identify opportunities and solutions? How do we extend the conversation so it's not just a bubble talking about creativity? And how do the biggies support the small players? This is an example in Belgium, Creative Wallonia, where they have had that kind of holistic ecosystem-based approach to creative development, the promotion of the creative society overall. But it's difficult. A lot of people talk about networks and hubs, and I'll talk a little bit about networks and hubs coming up. They shouldn't be hygienic, corporatized, They by their very nature, if they're going to be transformational, they need to be messy, they need to be challenging. So, and the notion of a creative network, I think it needs also to be somehow insurgent. It needs to be pushing the boundaries. It needs to be going out there to break down the boundaries between different sectors. So to what extent does your tech network or your creative network, your creative hub, to what extent is that playing an insurgent role in shifting the conversation about what the economy should look like in the city? To what extent is it trying to open up new pathways for opportunities that go beyond the kind of silos that you might have in your economy or in your education sector? The second point is about place. What kind of places nurture creative practice? What kind of places are attractive to creative talent? What kind of places do you want to stay in and explore your creative potential in? Now, urbanization obviously is one of the kind of major global trends in the last few years. The urban population globally obviously going over 50% for the first time a couple of years ago. Cities are absolutely hyper-relevant. It's where the talent goes, it's where the aspiration gathers, but there's also that cities provide you with the openness, the opportunities for new relationships. They tend to be more tolerant, tend to be more inclusive, but they're also, by their very nature, more challenging in many ways. They challenge you as an individual. So to what extent in your city are creative opportunities forthcoming? How open, enabling, and generous are the networks and programs that facilitate creative interactions in your city? This is where we're based in London, in a district called Dalston in East London. This is Bootstrap, the building that we're based in. This is one type of hub. This is one idea around a hub. This is a social enterprise in an old paint factory, where in fact the artist Turner apparently used to mix his paints a long time ago. It's now a combination of workspaces. There's some co-working space, there are individual offices, there's cafes and bars, there's a theatre in the basement, a really interesting independent theatre. There's a really interesting music venue which focuses on kind of dissonant new music from around the world. It brings together people from different creative, social, and tech sectors, purposefully cross-art form and cross-sector. It's a place of production. Obviously people are working there, but it's also a place of consumption. It's a place to go at different times of the day. You go there for different reasons. It has this mix of uses, this mix of personalities, this mix of aspirations, this mix of literacies. This is the roof of Bootstrap, where there's a lot of screenings, there's gigs, there's talks, there's a community garden, a whole range of things. It brings together different sectors, different personalities, and we think, from our perspective, it's a great place to develop your business, but it's also a great place to learn and to grow, to feel nourished, to feel challenged. It's a place where you encounter lots of things, but critically, they're purposeful encounters. It's not just a kind of laissez-faire, well, let's put them all in there. They're purposeful encounters because it's almost a curated landscape for cultural and creative production and consumption. To what extent do you have those kinds of spaces in Malaysia? To what extent do you have those kinds of opportunities in this place, but also more broadly? And how can our hubs, our clusters, provide that kind of diverse economic base, become that touch point for the creative and freelance sector? So a lot of spaces focus on their tenants, but of course this is a network economy, and freelancers are floating around all over the place, spending a lot of time drinking coffee very slowly in Starbucks and places like that. How can we bring them into the hubs, into the conversation, so that they themselves can feel part of it and can develop and grow in that mix, rather than just the people who are based there? So how inclusive is it? How much of a breeding ground are your hubs? And to what extent do they play a wider kind of ripple effect in placemaking? You know, do they become part of the vibrancy of the urban landscape, the place to come and participate, as well as the place to come and do business? So should we be focusing on how your creative workspace is also a driver for culture-led regeneration, for cultural tourism even? Now, what I find fascinating in KL is there's a really emergent hub scene from the kind of shiny stuff, the hard infrastructure, the clocks, if you like, in Cyberjaya, through to a more networked, perhaps more nuanced emergence of hubs across the city, whether it's here, there's the art printing house. in Bangsar, there's this question around how we animate and nurture and connect the networks here. I don't know if any of you have been to these events, how do you pronounce that? Rio? I never known how to pronounce that. Anyone been to these things that have been emerging in the city over the last few months? Yeah. See, I think that's really interesting as an intervention, because it kind of brings together an agenda around nurturing creative talent with nurturing creativity in the city, animating the landscape, making it more attractive. It's kind of stickier, more dynamic. And then, of course, there are some other interventions which I think are quite interesting. And this goes back to my point about distinctiveness. You have a set of tools in this city that are different to any other city, as any other city could say about themselves. So how do you nurture and connect and amplify what you have and what you're doing well? So the kind of reinvention of the mall in Publica, thinking of that as a cultural producer as well as a place for avid consumption. And of course, there are also the kind of, what I would say perhaps more mainstream startup incubation and accelerator programs. But my question is around how embedded they are and how connected they are to that wider creative and cultural landscape, to the fuzz and the fizz and the buzz that you have across the city. And how do you plug Cyberjaya into that messiness and vice versa? How do you animate and make those connections? How do you build the ecosystem that joins together all the dots and lifts all the ships? This is one of my favorite examples. This is Televiski in Tallinn in Estonia, in an old industrial kind of plot of land just outside of downtown. This is run on a cooperative model. There is a kind of private landlord who's given a corporation, a cooperative of creative and cultural organizations, a long-term lease to basically animate this industrial landscape and turn it into a creative place. It co-locates a whole range of different units, purposefully positioned to provide a complementary function that enables ultimately this to work as a cultural and creative hub, bringing together, there's studio space for performing arts, providing affordable studio space for independent theatre, there's co-working space, there's all sorts of cafes and bars, there's some grow-on space for businesses that can afford to and will pay a higher rent to be there, which cross-subsidizes some of the more informal spaces. So it's a curated mix of uses, providing a dynamic role in the city. And we're seeing this in other parts of Southeast Asia as well. It's not just a European model. Hanoi Creative City is a case of a private developer looking long-term to nurture creative practice in the city. And we're seeing a kind of set of sort of super tools as well. Every city, every hub almost now has a Fab Lab or something, but how do you build that to the next level? So these mega creative spaces, Makerversity, for example, in London and Amsterdam, which brings together a whole kind of maker culture with a tech and a cultural sector, through programming, through fast courses, as well as more systemic education programs, through industry partnerships, a whole range of different interventions in creative placemaking. In London, I mentioned earlier on in Shoreditch, the challenge around inclusion. And Tech City is, in a sense, it's a bit like a kind of embedded Cyberjaya. It's right in the middle of the city. It's a place where there's still lots of micro businesses working across the creative, cultural, and third sectors. The design challenge is around how integrated it is, but there's been a lot of work that embeds it, ensures that the tech sector doesn't sit apart from the wider creative, cultural, and community sectors. The programs, the models are quite familiar in terms of the kind of accelerator investment programs that they've got, the skills and education programs, but it's a relatively open model, it's a relatively inclusive model. On a more kind of place-based approach in King's Cross in London, behind King's Cross Station, this has been a long-term development or regeneration program, a lot of it in old industrial buildings. Critically, and the developers understood this, critically it's anchored by Central St. Martin's, one of the major art schools in the world. Because they recognize that brings dynamism, diversity of use, energy, youthfulness. It helps to animate the public realm, helps to make it an aspirational place that brings in other consumers, but it also helps to bring in other kinds of businesses, because it's obviously driven by how much property they can ultimately sell. So a lot of knowledge-intensive, tech-intensive businesses have moved to the district because of that culture-led approach to placemaking. So Google, even despite the horror show that is Brexit, Google has decided to invest its new HQ and put it into King's Cross to connect with that wider cultural, creative, and education landscape. And again, in KL, there's a lot of work to think about how you do create that sustainable, diverse, finer grain kind of place, not just sweeping away the old to create the aspirational new, embedding creative and knowledge-intensive practice in the fabric of the old city. So think city, working in the old central part of KL, are thinking imaginatively about how you do nurture that district as a creative place, not just creating creative parks, as is often the case. Number 3, and I'll whiz through this, property. Now, this is not about property as in buildings, it's about IP. Now, the tech sector obviously gets a lot of investment and support in terms of understanding and building IP literacy. It's not so much a problem, although it continues to be a challenge. The creative sector, though, struggles with IP. It struggles with notions of ownership. It struggles with building a sense of what you have and what you own, how you translate that into commercial potential, how you monetize that, but also critically how you collaborate. A lot of creative people, although they need to collaborate, that's the lifeblood of them, they struggle to collaborate because they don't want to lose what they see as their IP, their idea. So this goes back to my point earlier on about creative entrepreneurship. As part of the creative entrepreneurship process, to what extent do we build IP literacy so that people can more effectively develop and share their ideas, as they will need to do if they're going to develop creative businesses that have a life. Own It, I should say, is, sorry, how do I go back? Own It is now defunct, but it served its purpose. This was an IP service set up through the University of the Arts in London that focused on developing IP literacy for people when they're in the university sector. It got together a lot of law firms who provided some pro bono IP support and set up some models, some courses and some literature, which is still available online actually, to help to provide that kind of comfort zone for creative businesses as they explore their ideas in terms of how they might nurture them and monetize them and collaborate through them. But it also provided some tailored business support around IP to the undergraduates so that they were more ready to enter the marketplace afterwards. Another way of looking at this is what the Korean creative content agency has been doing for a few years now, hugely successfully, joining together a whole range of support and services which are for IP-centered creative businesses. They do a lot of work around IP literacy, building an awareness around just the basics around IP and how you develop and grow businesses through your creative content. They do a lot of work around supporting and investing in and subsidizing actually the process of IP protection so that their creative talent is developing scalable businesses through their IP. They invest in businesses once they've got their IP regimes in place to develop and to grow in a very export-ready way. And then they promote and they distribute creative talent and creative products and services internationally. So a lot of major cities have got a Kocha even office, which is the front door for a whole range of support services for creative and content businesses based back in South Korea. And a critical agenda here is around readying creative businesses in understanding the role that their IP plays, not just in creating or generating products or services from within the creative industries, but readying them to collaborate across the boundaries of different sectors. So as I mentioned earlier, the tech sector is ultimately going to if it's going to go to the next level, it needs to work with the creative sector. So how can we ready our creative businesses so they feel they're not working with tech companies from a position of disadvantage or inferiority when it comes to their IP assets? So they can be providers of content, which is the key ingredient that scales up that tech, as opposed to being service providers who get the fee but don't get the long-term value. So to what extent does IP support enable our creatives to flourish in that environment? Fourthly, pipes. So to what extent do we have decent digital infrastructure beyond the hubs that we're in, like where we are today? And to what extent, looking at a regional level, are we globally competitive in terms of our infrastructure here? It's quite interesting in terms of, from a market perspective, which is obviously critical for the scale up and growth of the creative industries, particularly for digital content industries. The differences in different parts of Southeast Asia. So unsurprisingly, Singapore and to a lesser extent Malaysia have got really high internet penetration rates, which obviously means that's your marketplace for a lot of creative digital content businesses. But in other parts of the region, there's a real issue because the connectivity isn't as it should be, which means the market's small. So there's a regional strategic interest in building internet connectivity across the marketplace so you can develop and grow the creative industries even more. And that's where, if you were to compare from a European or North American context, that's where there's an advantage they have there for their regional markets in that you can, the online customer base is so much proportionately bigger in those markets. But of course, it doesn't mean that you can't reach them anyway, but that means you have to align your products and services to those markets, to the European and North American market, whereas your regional market is still going to be emergent whilst online customer base is still emergent. But then there's the functional stuff around production. That's consumption. For production, and we all know the problem in Malaysia, you've got one of the most avid and boosterish creative and digital sectors, and yet your average internet speed is so appalling, which obviously is a major structural constraint to sector development and growth. It's not appalling in certain hubs, but the question is around how that spreads across the wider fabric of the city and into the smaller cities and rural areas. So there's a clocks challenge for you all there. And this is an issue. If you're in KL, you only need to walk around the corner to suddenly, fall off a connectivity cliff. But it's not just about the hardware. It's not just about the clocks, as I mentioned. It's also about the clouds. So how do we nurture digital literacy across our creative industry sector? And how do we develop those intersections where creative talent can come together with tech talent to develop new content-based industries that are explorative, that are generating new business models that are applicable to future opportunities. So this is a kind of clocks and clouds model coming together, digital creativity labs, which is a combination of universities across the UK working with different businesses to develop and scale creative and tech businesses as part of the same ecosystem. A world centre, they say that, I'm not sure whether they are a world centre of excellence, but they're certainly very good at connecting research and development agendas that connect the gamers with the artists, that connect the technologists with the ideas people. Not that technologists aren't ideas people, but you get the idea. And it's the interdisciplinary that's really key there. Historically, in a university context, you'd have your computer science people working over there, and you'd have your humanities people working over there. Their ideas, you bring it together, and you bring it together with industry as well. A finer grain example is the Pervasive Media Studio in Bristol, in the southwest of England. This is run out of an old art centre, really, an art house cinema complex. Pervasive Media Studio is co-financed by the cultural centre, which is called Watershed, which gets funding from national government. It's supported also by one of the universities, which has got some space in this studio, and it's supported by the tenants in terms of the money they bring to the table. But it brings together purposefully people from different backgrounds who are all working one way or another in developing new kinds of media content and technology. It has in the mix, in this kind of purposefully curated hub, they have, believe it or not, astronomers sitting next to artists. They have philosophers working next to tech people. And the way that they make those encounters purposeful is that they commission across the boundaries. So they have funding, small grants, projects, project-based finance to get them to work together, to explore what they can do together. And they create that social space which nurtures interaction, which in turn generates that R&D and ultimately commercial space for new types of business to be developed. Fifth, picture. How do you tell the story of your creative economy, your creative assets, your creative journey? So there's different elements to this. On the one hand, it's about data. I showed you earlier on a big infographic from the UK around the creative industries being important. That's underpinned by a whole shift in the way that we measure creativity, in the way that we code our economy so that we can actually identify certain kinds of jobs. Now, we know from our work in Malaysia in trying to develop this KL Klang Valley creative blueprint that it's actually really, really hard to identify and to measure, to count creative businesses across this city, across this conurbation. Because the standard industrial and occupational classifications don't identify lots of creative jobs. So they become invisible. They're also invisible in many ways because they're micro businesses. So they sit below the radar. A one-man, two-man, three-man business does not get counted generally. It's almost seen as part of the informal economy. So how do we first of all, describe the value of the creative industries if we can't count it? But critically as well, though, how do we engage with those people if they're invisible? So there's a structural question here around data and data capture, which is really important if we're going to develop and grow the creative industries long term, to make the case. The government at the moment is very responsive. We see that through Sendano. We're going to see that when the PM hopefully launches this blueprint next year. But governments aren't always responsive, and different departments may hold back because they haven't got the data, so they're not convinced. So we need to improve the data capture. But it's also about intelligence. It's not just about data. It's about understanding the sector, the profile, the dynamics of the sector, its development needs, its aspirations, its stories. It's about a more diverse baseline than just a map of the sector would give you. So to what extent do we consult and engage with our creative businesses in the same way that the finance sector is engaged and consulted? To what extent do we understand the skills profile, the development needs, the aspirations, the challenges of the creative industry sector? And in what other ways can we understand how it works? So this is a map of creative and tech businesses in Shoreditch in central East London, and it's mapping the intensity of social media interactions on Twitter coming out of certain postcode locations. So to what extent can you tell those kinds of stories? And to what extent can that in turn generate value and generate intelligence and generate a community of interest as well? I find that fascinating, that map. It just totally describes a different story. But fundamentally, though, it's about articulating value. We are struggling, to be honest, in the development of the blueprint for KL to be able to really talk up the value of the sector, because the data isn't as strong as it should be, because we can't find the businesses. We know they're there, we see them in the networks, but they can't be counted through official statistic processes, which means that we can't make the arguments like they have been doing here in Scotland in terms of the financial and the wider value proposition that the sector provides. Instead, we have to draw on best practice elsewhere. We need to develop case studies. We need to sort of weave a story through a range of sources. But it's harder to do that. But the data also helps you to make more subtle arguments. So I'm all for the economic value of the creative industries. That's the thing that gets government to wake up, the employability opportunities it generates. But I think that the data also enables you to make more subtle values, for example, around the role of culture and the arts in your creative ecosystem. The more holistic understanding of where value and how value is generated. And you can only do that if you've got the data to evidence it. So in the UK, there was a program run by the University of Warwick which focused on cultural value, enriching Britain culture, creativity, and growth. And this looked at how we describe a diverse set of strategic outcomes that you get from investment in culture and the creative industries. And it was able, because of the data, to do all of this boosterish stuff, 1.7 million people, lots and lots of billions of pounds generated by the sector, all good. That's the first thing you say. But it was also able, because it had the evidence, to be able to say that the sector was also generating other kinds of value. So if you have a sector that participates in cultural activities, that encounters lots of creative opportunities, is able to go affordably to the theatre, is able to participate in performing arts, is able to not just watch films from America, but also to make films made in this case, the UK. If you're able to generate a scene as well as a sector, you also generate outcomes for health, for well-being. You can generate a more inclusive and aspirational society as a whole, which obviously enables you to articulate that culture matters, and that investment in culture is actually a key feeder for investment in the economy, but also for a happier, healthier society. And finally, in terms of data and picture, that point about how we tell our story is really important. So in the UK, just a couple of years ago, as a startup, we have this new thing called the Creative Industries Federation. So industry-led, membership-based network, organization, which brings together the diverse interests from arts through to commercial creative industries under one broad umbrella, which in turn generates visibility and voice, but also is generating new research, which in turn articulates its value proposition to itself, which is important for confidence and cohesion, but also back to government as well. So what are the organizing dynamics for your creative industries in KL and in Malaysia? What is your community? And to what extent do you officialize and build a more structured approach, so where the cloud interfaces with the clock? Sixth, investment. And I'm sure that a lot of people in this event have been talking about different investment models and how you get how you become more attractive to investors. In other words, how you become more investment ready. So going back to the point about people and skills and education and creative entrepreneurship, to what extent is that nurturing more investment-ready businesses? To what extent is the IP support that you're getting enabling you to be able to pitch to different types of investors? And this is a changing landscape all of the time. There are lots of investment programs in Europe and North America geared towards the creative industries. In Asia, it tends to be geared towards the tech sector, and there is a bit of a disconnect. So perhaps one of the things we should be exploring is around tailored investment programs for creative and tech and how they connect and how they collide going forward. And certainly that could be something that the organizations like My Creative Ventures, which obviously is a brother organization to Sendana, the new cultural development agency, they can explore whether there are new investment models there. But it's not just about investment ready and nurturing the competence and investment appeal of creative businesses. It's also about investor readiness. We've seen this in so many countries where you're never investment ready unless you support and nurture a literacy about the investment proposition in the creative industries from the perspective of the investor. So just as your mums and dads would have said a creative job isn't a real job, there's a whole cohort of investors out there who thinks the creative industries isn't an investment proposition. They don't see the value of it. They can't understand the value of it. And it's partly an IP issue. It's partly because the data hasn't been there, going back to that point again, that picture point. It's also partly because of their prejudices, and it's partly because they see that there are lower risk opportunities elsewhere, or they think they are, but actually they're missing out because the risk profile of the creative industries, when you look at the research, isn't any higher than the risk profile of a lot of tech and science sectors. So we need to nurture an investor readiness agenda as well. Find those people who are hungrier and more au fait with the creative industries, build that community, meet and greet them, connect with them, and explore with them and just demystify the different business models that are at play across the creative industries, re-describe or realign what success looks like in different parts of the creative industries, get them to understand where the value lies, where businesses pivot, where there are opportunities to make some money. And one way of doing that is to introduce, as a pilot, new types of finance that in turn generate the evidence base around the investment opportunities that the creative industries generates. So we evaluated this program in the UK called Creative Industries Finance, which is actually a debt finance initiative, small loans for creative businesses, enabling them to develop and to grow. Absolute outstanding success in terms of nobody defaulted on their loans. No business went out of business over the window period we were measuring for 3 years. Most of them grew. A lot of them got next stage investment. So that kind of small program became a demonstrator for what happens when you invest in a targeted way in the creative industries and wrap it up with some wider business support activities. So what can we do in a Malaysian context there? And how do we connect those kinds of programs around investment to a wider support environment, to the hubs, to the clusters, so they become a kind of pipeline for investment-ready creative businesses? And how do we connect that to a wider public investment program in arts and culture? And this is a really interesting agenda, I think, for Sendana, the new agency, is that how can you nurture entrepreneurship in the cultural sector so that organizations in performing arts, in music, in entertainment generally, are generating business models that are scalable, or generating content that in turn generates scalable business models through alliance with tech businesses. And this is happening a lot in other countries at the moment. I mentioned Nesta earlier on, who are coming here again, coming here in a couple of weeks. They've been exploring a whole series of digital development programs, digital R&D programs in the arts and cultural sector. They had a digital accelerator for the arts, where they, as a test bed, invested in an accelerator program for 12 arts organizations, and basically ended up with a pitch to investors in the city. What was fascinating was that ultimately 2 of them have got next stage investment through this accelerator program. And these are historically seen as subsidy-dependent, not-for-profit arts organizations. One of them has got significant investment through the virtual reality program they were developing for their museum. But the tech was transferable to other sectors in retail. So they were an R&D program, in a sense, for scalable business models that transfer into other sectors. So what can we do in Malaysia to nurture the environment, to develop more tailored investment and investor readiness activities through the tools at our disposal? And how can we also look in subtle ways at incentivizing investment, tax reliefs for investment in the creative industries, which has made a really big difference in the UK in terms of games, theatre even, where you get tax relief for investment in that. And not just tax relief in terms of a kind of cluster proposition, but tax relief across the sector as a whole. Seventh, and finally, perception. How do we tell our story? How do we position ourselves regionally and globally to pull the attention of the world to here as a creative place, a creative country, a creative sector, to give our creative talent a sense that they can fulfill their potential by staying here and connecting here, or coming back here earlier, but also attracting talent from across the region as a hub, as a cluster, but as a creative place. So some countries have put the creative industries to the foreground of their kind of soft power, the way they position themselves. This is Estonia, which is a tiny country by the Baltic Sea, where Skype incidentally came from. Rather than selling their national story as a kind of cultural heritage proposition or as a tourism destination, they've foregrounded their creative industry sector, their fashion, their design, their tech sector. And Luvesti is how they want to position themselves globally. And they've matched that with a whole range of other interventions. The UK has tried that, but I think fails because the tone's a little bit wrong. It's a bit too arrogant. It's a bit too old-fashioned, a bit too old school. But what they still do is champion the creative industries at the sharp end of their national narrative. Malaysia obviously doesn't do that yet. It's going for a more essentialist sort of, a kind of exoticized version of itself. It's geared towards a kind of cultural tourism narrative rather than a contemporary, productive, creative narrative. But also, how do you use your platforms, your trade shows, to become more interactive, more edifying, have more personality, such as Dutch Design Week, which sits at the heart of their national branding as well. And this isn't a design show, it's not a trade show you go to find a buyer. It's a place you go to interact, to explore collaboration opportunities, to see what is trending, what risks people are taking. And so this works at a city level as well. A city like Bristol in the southwest of England, it's got the clocks on the left-hand side. They've developed a structural, strategic approach to the creative industries with their creative and tech manifesto. But the kind of cloud stuff is around how they tell their cultural story, around their subcultures, their distinctive arts and cultural sector. It's the city where Massive Attack came from, Tricky came from, Banksy, the graffiti artist, that kind of softer, distinctive cultural narrative. And that is being aligned to the harder strategic inward investment and creative industries development agenda. And we're seeing a cultural and creative narrative increasingly playing a productive, progressive role in placemaking internationally. So to finish, in a Malaysian context, in a KL context, how do you tell, on the one hand, the story of authenticity, of distinctiveness, of messiness, of sense of change, of churn, of opportunity that's kind of somehow indefined, with, on the other hand, your kind of clean-lined, hygienic, safe kind of message and narrative? Or how do you, in other words, tell a story of the mall on the one hand and the mess, the edgy, the distinctive on the other, the downtown KL where Think City is working versus the spaces and places where so many people spend their time in shopping centres? How do you align those different, often separate kinds of senses of place, senses of identity, to tell a strong story? And I think it comes to the way you position your creative talent to the foreground of your national narrative, and the way that you position creative talent as critical to your future success. This is just another way of talking about clocks and clouds again, just to finish my talk. We often talk in an overly rigid and structured way about supply chains or value chains, particularly within the tech sector, and it becomes a bit of a closed shop. It becomes about how you link business-to-business opportunities in a relatively linear way. But I think we need to move beyond that to talk instead about what I call value webs. That's about connecting lots of often quite distinctive and different perspectives from different sectors with different personalities, which though are driven by creativity and cultural expression, and you connect those to your more structured value chain and structured encounters. And that's, if you do that in a way that enables people from different disciplines to connect with one another and to plug into that main hardline economic development agenda that you see in places like Cyberjaya, then I think you have an opportunity. So how do you nurture value webs in Malaysia to play a globally significant role as a hub for creative development going forward? So what are your priorities? We're all creative, we've all got talent, we've all got imagination, but do we fulfill it, and what do we need to do to make sure we don't, that talent isn't wasted, and that the opportunities the country has are not underdeveloped and under-nurtured? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming. We may have run out of time a little bit, but if Dr. Fleming, if you are okay to take a few questions from the audience. Is there anyone?
Hi, Doctor. You did mention just now about KL City for creative development, and you face difficulty because of data availability. Do you mind to share how you overcome this, and what's the strategy to overcome this?
In KL?
Yeah.
In different ways. What we've done, we're working with local partners, Frost & Sullivan and My Performing Arts Agency. We basically had to almost put together a jigsaw where the pieces don't align. So for some sectors, such as in audiovisual, the data is quite good. So you can get deeper, more detailed information. The same to an extent for tech, digital tech, content industries. So that, we've been shining a light on that because the data is good, but also for the other sectors, we've been trying to use that to demonstrate where there are gaps. So we've been using a mix of quantitative data for where the data exists with qualitative data where we've been engaging with the sector for them to tell us what's missing and what the ecosystem looks like. And then you kind of piece it together and try to tell a sort of overall story around the profile and dynamics of the creative industries. So in a way, what we're doing is describing the evidence base as it looks like, but also describing it as it might be if we had the resources to invest in proper research to develop a proper baseline for the sector. So it's slightly chicken and egg. Really, what needs to be done is there needs to be a kind of wholesale restructuring of the way that data is collected for the whole creative industry sector, probably for the whole economy, because it's a little bit out of kilter with the reality of the modern economy. And then there needs to be investment in the continual upkeep of that data. I mentioned the UK, the data is pretty good because once they restructured the way the sector's defined and measured, they annually can kind of reboot that. So you get these data bulletins which give you a current picture of the sector, and you can benchmark in terms of the way that investment is actually delivering outcomes. We can't do that yet here because we can't get a decent enough baseline. So who's to say what impact investment is making? So it's a really critical thing to focus on, I think, for Malaysia. Okay.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Cheryl. Just curious, but a few years back, I've been informed by the Tech City in UK. They were saying that in UK, they developed some of the industry like startup, for example, like fintech, everything in London, and some like a broadcast, everything in Manchester. So they actually make sure that other cities also grow as part of the UK. So what do you think about Malaysia? Because instead of just concentrate in KL.
Yeah, it's a dilemma really. I know that obviously politically there's a need to distribute investment, but actually I think strategically it makes sense as well. The challenge is around identifying what the distinctive strengths might be in certain cities. So I know there's been a lot of investment in Johor, for example, around film, which may or may not make sense for sector development. It probably makes sense for strategic development in terms of distributing approaches to the creative industries across the country. The way to test that is by nurturing the ecosystem. So Georgetown has, over a long period, there's been a lot of investment, particularly around culture, and that's in turn kind of created new opportunities for other kinds of creative business to develop and to grow there, and in a distinctive way to that place. So I'd say you've got to work across all of the cities and to try to find the sweet spot that they have in terms of their creative strengths and assets. But fundamentally, it's KL or Klang Valley which is going to be the key driver, because that's where the people are. It's where the investment goes. It's where the connectivity is broadly in terms of globally. Particularly when you get the fast train as well, kind of coming up from Singapore, it creates this, with Johor, it creates this whole kind of a corridor potentially for creative and knowledge economy at a regional or global level. It could be really scalable. But you've got to find ways to find complementary activities in those other cities. We're still struggling in the UK. I mean, there is this kind of smart specialization in Manchester for things like Media City, but the size of the sector isn't anything like it is in London. But that's partly because of the fundamental attributes that London has as a global city. One of the ways as well of looking at it is around how you develop kind of complementary activities in the cities. So looking at things like hubs and clusters, so you can create the spaces for people to develop activities which would be too expensive in somewhere like KL, but plugging them into KL, or in our case London, so that you do get those kind of business-to-business links, that you do fund them to be able to find spaces in London as well, so that they can do their development work outside, but they have come in for their business or commercial transactions. So looking at how you connect is really key as well. So, but it's a real design challenge.
We'll take the other side first, and we'll come to you.
Hi, I'm Zaza. I'm from Gumalasari, and we actually produce products from Songket, which is one of our heritage. So I'm seeing now what you're planning to do, or what you have done with London and so on and so forth. But I'm looking at the creative side where it is up to date. It is more to hipster. It is more attacking youngsters, whereas in Malaysia, like what you mentioned just now, Malaysia focuses more on ethnicity, the exoticness of Malaysia. So how do you take, or how do you change that from a community or from locals who are already desensitized with all this and have put the culture aside as a relic, and to, in change, asking them to embrace this? Yeah. Because I'm seeing at Rio just now, I managed to look through. Rio is more or less a contemporary, I would say a contemporary platform. So, because Malaysia has a lot of culture based. Yeah. So how do we that specifically involved in this culture based creative industry are going to survive? Okay. Yeah.
It's obviously not easy, and I think that there are issues around how this kind of urban aesthetic, this hipsterization, is actually having a kind of excluding role for other cultural narratives. There has to be ways to look at programming activities that kind of interconnect. I think diversity in investment and program is a fundamental thing that needs to be developed, not just looking at one or the other. Skills and education pathways are really important. So validating creative industries activities for people from different backgrounds, not just certain backgrounds, I think is really key as well. So it's not just seen as a metropolitan kind of agenda. I think the investment in cultural practice is really key. And not just cultural practices as some kind of authenticated thing from your cultural heritage, but enabling people who are from different backgrounds to develop sustainable creative businesses and content and ideas through their distinctive ethnicity, I think is really key. There's some interesting work going that we were connected with in Jamaica, for example, which was exploring how some of their kind of cultural sort of notional roots were telling stories and kind of creating a cultural sense of place, which was really relevant in terms of their animation sector. So there's a cultural aesthetic value which somehow is aligned with their distinctive identities, which actually can develop content which in turn is scalable. So you don't want to just sort of think of the modern as somehow exclusive of cultural heritage. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's another thing. There's a lot of, Estonia is interesting actually, and as I mentioned, because they've done a lot of work around market development locally or market validation. So kind of buy local stuff, and trying to go for that. There's a real trend around provenance and connecting with the buyer, understanding where something's come from. But that tends to happen more in food and drink, and to some extent in crafts and design. So we need to kind of widen that out, so that things like the influence of, let's say, something like batik can be brought into contemporary fashion. So it becomes something that is an aspirational good again. But that requires campaigning and case studies and role models and things like that.
Because we have been looking into Indonesia, because they have been pushing batik for quite a while, and it has tremendous success.
Yeah.
We can't even bring our batik to their places, even for a small manufacturing.
Yeah.
So now we're trying to push for the same thing to be done here in Malaysia. So it's quite depressing. At the same time, it's quite frustrating, frankly speaking. Again, it goes back to the fact that I can sell my product to overseas people. I can go to Paris, I can go to New York, and I'm selling it. But I can't even sell to Malaysian people.
Well, that story needs to be told here, because it's interesting how if you are selling in those kinds of, in those markets which actually often have a kind of market generating or trend generating role, then that should in turn be promoted here, and then you probably find that that follows back. Modest fashion is a really big opportunity here as well, and there's so much, rather than just thinking from a Western aesthetic, thinking around how you can be market leaders in that I think is really key. Sure. So.
One last one, probably. Yeah.
Hi, Tom. Good afternoon.
Hi.
My name is Hussein. I represent the creative industry, and I find that the last 10 years, the UK has been a go-to place to create visual effects and movies and all that, right? So they have taken almost all the jobs from Los Angeles, Hollywood. Now they are doing it in UK. So what is UK doing right that Malaysia can replicate?
Don't replicate, first of all.
Don't replicate, okay.
No, do something on your own terms. That, there's a sort of je ne sais quoi that, because we need to find what that is. What the UK's done right structurally, which is a kind of clocks issue, is that they've been pretty good in terms of tax breaks, and so that's attracted a lot of activity from the US broadly. It's about investment and what return you get on that investment. So a lot of that is incentivized activity on the one hand. On the other hand, it's also around the wider talent pool. So the UK has invested quite a lot in skills, and not just the creative skills, but also the backstage skills, the behind camera and the technical and the post-production stuff, and obviously the facilities around that. So there is a labor pool that people, big studios can come in from other parts of the world, and they know that they will get the services that they require. So that's, I think, a key thing. Right? They don't have to bring their people, the people are there, which makes it cheaper as well, ultimately. And there's something about ease of doing business as well, and the lack of bureaucracy and that kind of stuff. And the English language obviously helps, particularly with North American customers. But it's still quite vulnerable. Brexit is going to puncture a lot of that, because some of that talent pool will move on anyway. Yeah. Exactly, yeah. So, and confidence is another thing. So there's a market opportunity as well because of that in somewhere like Malaysia. But investment in talent is the key thing in all of this. Getting a big enough labour market to be able to service large-scale productions as they come in, and to have that level of specialism and also breadth is really key.
How far are we away from that?
Probably not that far, actually. I mean, it's hard to tell. I mean, I think the difficulty is that it's not concentrated enough yet, and I don't think you've got the scene, that wider cultural landscape, which is so important, I think, in terms of some of these sectors, and there's probably not enough finance knocking around. So there are elements that are missing, like that. I think looking at a kind of regional cluster that links to Singapore will be key, rather than seeing them as competitors. Actually see how you align and complement one another, even though that's politically difficult. But from a sector basis, I think that there will be a level of integration around services and infrastructure with the bottom of the peninsula. And also looking regionally as well. I mean, it's interesting, in the lift here, you see I was reading all the rooms of the different Southeast Asian cities, and thinking of the role that Malaysia and KL in particular plays as a hub and a connector, an aggregator for all the amazing stuff that's happening in those different cities. So make it a place that's where it's as easy as possible to do creative business, and it's a place to co-locate and to collaborate rather than just trade. I think is really key as well. Okay.
Dr. Fleming, if you have time, we'll just take one last one, crucial one.
Hi, Dr. Fleming. My name is Taufik. I'm an architect. I have two questions, actually. The first one is actually in terms of of course, we have to map and understand the different forms of the creative enterprises or business form, maybe related to that lady from the startup to the middle-sized company. And then you have the corporates and the big agencies, which they are also part of the creative economy, that's the driver. So in sort of your process of mapping out the blueprint of KL, what seems to be the sort of current direction in terms of prioritizing, the networking or strategifying this sort of value chain of top-down or bottom-up approach when it comes to sort of, looking at creative economy as a national income generator. And second, coming from a background of corporate as well, a lot of the programs relating to the creation of creative agenda always deals with a risk of the insurgency or, like you said, the agency of creativity. And that might sort of risk, investment to some of the players here. So maybe you could sort of talk a bit about that sort of risk assessment, maybe one from the benefit of the creative entrepreneurs, and second in terms of from the corporate themselves in looking into funding the creative enterprises. Thanks.
Oh, God, they're questions, aren't they?
Yeah, I'm an urban strategist.
Well, just on the first one, I think what the blueprint process has told us, which is that there's been a real disconnect in terms of, on a national strategic level, positioning Malaysia as a place to invest in and kind of plug in and play. And that's what Cyberjaya is, really, with actually nurturing a kind of diverse and dynamic talent base made up of micro creative businesses, particularly ones that are more aligned historically to arts and cultural activities. So one of the outcomes is this new agency, Sendana, which will play a really formative role in connecting those worlds. And I think that's going to be the key thing to the next level in terms of development and growth for the sector. So it's not just clean-lined, tech-driven growth, it's also has roots that connect across into content and cultural activities. Your second question was it's more labyrinthine, your second question, wasn't it? It had some...
Yeah, it's about the content, creating content in terms of being insurgent.
Yeah, well, I'm of a kind of perspective you need to do both. So that there's some heavy lifting that needs to be done to build organizational capacity and stronger networks and stronger clusters and hubs. I think you probably do need some kind of industry-based network or union or federation or something that builds your visibility and voice. But also there needs to be a lot more encouragement of the grassroots and a lot more championing of the kind of messier stuff. So it's interesting that the RIA stuff is coming from My Creative Ventures. So it's kind of a policy instrument, but that needs to be encouraged to be commissioned for independent organizations to develop and drive their own activities as well. If I can do a plug, actually, the British Council's done some interesting research about cultural and creative hubs across Malaysia, and it's looking at those more kind of independently driven spaces which are coming up, and they're not all kind of hipsterish. There's a mix of them, and I think that supporting and validating them will be important, so you can start to build a kind of capacity and confidence for the sector beyond the kind of more corporately driven stuff. And that links into things like how you secure long-term leases for creative practice in these hubs in the city, so that they don't just become meanwhile spaces that get bulldozed by developers to build condos and that kind of thing. So I think we need both, nurture the grassroots and champion the bigger stuff.
I guess that's all the time we have for today. If you have any other questions, if Dr. Fleming is around and free, you could just catch him outside. Yeah. Dr. Fleming, thank you so much for making time to be here today.
Thank you,
and for your questions and answers. And participants, thank you also for coming by and making time to listen to this. We'll commence back here at 4:30 today with the future of mobility. Yeah, till then, have a good lunch. Thank you.